The streets of Rio de Janeiro had their usual life that afternoon, with children running barefoot across the uneven pavement, vendors calling out the prices of roasted corn and chilled coconut water, and the distant hum of samba music drifting from a quarter bar. Amidst this ordinary chaos, a small mongrel dog with a patchy brown coat and soulful black eyes trotted along the sidewalk, tail wagging gently as if he carried with him a secret joy that the world had not yet discovered. He belonged to no one in particular in the eyes of most passers-by, but in truth, he was the beloved companion of one of the most famous men of Liverpool, the footballer whose name echoed not only in Brazil but in every corner of the globe where the game was worshipped. The little dog, named Preto for the dark patch over his eye, often wandered a little away from the modest but elegant house where Peel liked to retreat from the endless noise of fame. Preto had the freedom of the neighborhood. Children loved him. Old women sometimes tossed scraps his way, and he was known to curl himself into a warm patch of sun outside the bakery, until someone called his name. He was harmless, affectionate, and in many ways a quiet symbol of the humility that Pell tried to preserve despite his towering legend. On that day, however, fate had prepared a collision between innocence and cruelty, a man whose name no one would remember clearly later because he would come to be known only as the unknown man strode down the same street, with a swagger born not of wealth or honor, but of a mean streak that liked to show itself whenever he thought no one was watching. His face bore the roughness of a man who had seen too many bottles of cheap catcha and too few days of honest work. His eyes darted about, not with curiosity but with the restless suspicion of someone, always expecting trouble or seeking to cause it. He spotted Preto sniffing near a lamp-post, his ears perked as if listening to a hidden melody in the wind. Something twisted in the man's chest, not empathy but irritation, the sight of the happy little animal living freely when he himself felt chained by his own bitterness. Without hesitation, and with a grin that lacked any trace of kindness, he lifted his leg and sent a sharp, cruel kick into Preto's side. The dog yelped in pain, tumbling across the pavement, his small body skidding until he hit the base of a low wall. The children nearby gasped, and an old vendor cursed under his breath, but no one immediately moved, stunned by the suddenness of the act. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound, as if he had just scored a point in a game only he understood. "Fallow de me," he muttered, brushing his hands together, satisfied with the useless display of power. To him, it was just a dog, a nameless stray, and cruelty was entertainment. He did not know, and could not have guessed, that he had just laid his boot against the creature most cherished by Pell himself. Preto whimpered, trying to stand on shady legs. His tail no longer wagged but curled between his legs as he limped toward the corner, looking around as if searching for the one person who could make sense of what had just happened. And at that very moment, destiny tightened its strings. From down the road, stepping out of a sleek black car that had just pulled up, came Pell, dressed simply in slacks and a white shirt. He carried himself with the grace of a man who had lifted trophies before roaring crowds, yet he still moved like a neighbor returning home from errands. His face lit up when he saw Preto, but his smile froze when he noticed the dog's limp and the small cry that escaped from his throat. Pell's eyes narrowed, not with the fury of a hot-tempered man, but with the cold focus of someone who had endured countless tackles, insults, and unfair blows on the field, yet always remembered where the true line of justice lay. He rushed forward, crouching beside Preto, whispering softly in Portuguese, "Calma, meu amigo, calma." He stroked the dog's fur gently, examining his side with practiced care, for Pell had long since learned the value of attentiveness from the doctors and trainers who had kept him fit during his career. The crowd began to murmur, realization dawning on them that the injured dog was not merely a stray but belonged to the king of football himself. The unknown man froze in place. He had not noticed Pelé before, but now, seeing the unmistakable figure, his chest tightened with dread. He had heard the name his whole life, shouted from radios, printed in newspapers, painted on murals across crumbling walls. Pelé was not just a footballer, he was Brazil's pride, a living legend, the boy from Barro who had become the hero of nations. And he, a petty man of cruel habits, had just hurt Pelé's dog before his very eyes. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Preta's soft whimper. Then Pelé rose slowly, his eyes fixed on the man. The calmness in his face was almost more terrifying than any burst of anger. "Foi voc?" he asked simply, his voice deep, resonant, and controlled. The man stammered, his tone thick, his arrogance dissolving into nervous laughter. You know sabia some capturo," his excuse faltered, because even as he said it, he felt the crowd around him tightening like a noose. They were no longer passers-by, they were witnesses, protectors, defenders of their idol's dignity. A young boy stepped forward, pointing at the man with righteous anger. "Foi il, Pelé el chotelo prato." The child's voice carried the purity of truth, and soon others chimed in, confirming what had happened. The vendor shook his head, muttering, "Qui vergogna." The unknown man realized there was no escape. The weight of collective scorn pressed down on him harder than any punishment he had ever faced. He tried to back away, but Pelé raised a hand, and the motion alone was enough to still him in place. Pelé did not strike, did not shout, did not degrade the man in the way he perhaps deserved. Instead, he stepped closer, his towering presence radiating a quiet authority that needed no violence. "Ba attaque for a machacar animal indefenso?" he asked, his words sharp but steady. "And so no fora, I so covardia." His voice carried to everyone around, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The unknown man lowered his gaze, shame burning his face, though pride made him resist the urge to apologize outright. Pelé crouched once more beside Preto, lifting the little dog gently into his arms. The animal nestled into his chest, still trembling but comforted by the familiar heartbeat. The crowd parted to let Pelé pass, but he paused, turning once more to the man. "Vai embora," he said softly yet firmly. "I pensa bum, no que voc fes. Homens mostre no pelo que faz camas fortes, mas pelo que faz camas fracas." The words struck deeper than any blow could have. The man stumbled backward, muttering, and quickly disappeared into the alleyways, chased by whispers of contempt that would follow him long after. Pelé carried Preto toward his car, but he did not go straight home. Instead, he headed to a local veterinarian, determined to ensure that his friend had suffered no serious harm. The people who had witnessed the incident followed at a respectful distance, as if escorting their king, whispering among themselves about the cruelty they had just seen and the dignity with which Pelé had responded. It was not only a lesson for the unknown man, but for everyone present. Kindness, even in the face of cruelty, had a power greater than any act of violence. At the clinic, the veterinarian examined Preto carefully, announcing that while he had a bruise and would need rest, there were no broken bones. Relief washed over Pelé, and he kissed the dog's head softly, whispering his gratitude. But as he sat in the small waiting room afterward, he found himself replaying the scene in his mind, feeling the sting of what had nearly happened. Fame had brought him fortune and recognition, but it had also made every part of his life public, including the suffering of his loyal companion. He wondered whether he had done enough, whether his words had reached the man, or whether cruelty would always breed more cruelty in hearts unwilling to learn. The news, of course, spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, Newspapers carried headlines about the incident, and radio hosts discussed it with fiery passion. Some painted it as a story of heroism, Pelé defending his dog with noble restraint. Others debated the broader lesson: how society treated its animals, how violence often began with small acts of thoughtlessness. And somewhere in the midst of that storm, the unknown man hid, his name forgotten but his deed remembered, haunted by the eyes of Pelé that had pierced through his false bravado. For Pelé, life went on, but the memory lingered. He found himself watching Preta more closely, guarding him with greater care, as if aware that the world outside held dangers not only for men but for the innocent creatures that trusted them. Yet something else had begun to grow quietly in his mind, a sense that perhaps this incident was not merely random cruelty, but a spark that might ignite a larger conversation, one about compassion, responsibility, and the true measure of strength. And so, even as he trained young players, appeared at events, and spoke to the media, a seed had been planted, one that would grow into something unexpected and profound. But the story was far from over. The unknown man, though disgraced, had not disappeared entirely. His path would cross again with Pelé in ways neither of them could yet imagine, and the small act of cruelty he had committed would ripple outward, setting into motion events that would touch lives beyond his own. What began as a simple kick to a defenseless dog was about to become a tale of redemption, justice, and the enduring power of kindness in the face of cruelty. The days that followed in Rio were thick with gossip, for nothing spread faster in the neighborhoods than a story tied to Pelé. Vendors leaned over their stalls retelling the scene as if they had been standing in the front row, even if in truth they had only heard it secondhand. Taxi drivers argued about what they would have done in Pelé's place. Some swore they would have punched the man, others claimed they would have dragged him to the police, but everyone agreed on one thing: the king had shown a dignity that no one else could have mustered. He had defended not only his dog but also the idea that cruelty had no place among them. For Pelé, the glare of publicity was nothing new, but this story had touched something raw within him. He remembered his childhood in Bao, when his family had little more than the clothes on their backs and the love they shared. Animals had always wandered the dusty streets, then skinny dogs, ragged cats, even the occasional donkey, and he had felt a kinship with them, for they too survived on scraps and hope. He had promised himself long ago that if he ever had enough, he would make sure the creatures in his care never suffered the way he had seen others suffer. Preta was the embodiment of that promise, a living reminder of loyalty and gentleness in a world too often harsh. Preta healed quickly under Pelé's care. Within a week, the limb had disappeared, though he remained a little more cautious around strangers. He stuck close to Pelé whenever they walked together, his black eyes always glancing up as if to confirm that safety was nearby. Pelé, in turn, found his heart softening even more toward the little dog, treating him not just as a pet but as family. The bond between them deepened, and those who saw the footballer walking with Preta remarked that it was like watching a king with his trusted knight, each protecting the other in their own way. Meanwhile, the unknown man tried to vanish into obscurity, but whispers followed him. Neighbors pointed him out with disdain. Children mimicked his cruelty in play only to laugh, and then spit on the ground in mockery. Work grew harder to find, for who wanted to hire the man who had dared to kick Pelé's dog? His bitterness festered, and though he cursed Pelé's name under his breath, in the silence of his lonely nights he felt the sting of shame. Yet pride is a stubborn weed, and instead of bowing to remorse, he told himself that the world had turned against him unfairly. He nursed his anger like a wound, waiting for some chance to reclaim his dignity, though deep inside he knew he had none to reclaim. Weeks passed, and the incident might have faded into memory had not fate drawn the two men together again. Pelé had been invited to attend a community football tournament in one of Raya's poorer districts, and it was the kind of event he cherished, for it reminded him of the dusty fields where he himself had first chased a ball made of rags. He arrived with humility, shaking hands with children, greeting mothers, laughing with old men who told him they had listened to his matches on crackling radios. Preta trotted beside him, tail wagging, as comfortable among the people as his master was. The unknown man was there too, though not as a player or organizer. He lingered on the edges, drawn by curiosity and perhaps a twisted need to see again the man whose gaze had undone him. When he saw Pell walk into the field, the crowd parting with cheers, his chest tightened with envy. How could one man command such love? How could even a dog be treated with more respect than he, a human being? His fists clenched, but he stayed hidden, watching. The tournament unfolded with joy. Children chased the ball with reckless energy, their laughter ringing through the air. Paul watched them with shining eyes, clapping and offering gentle advice, encouraging teamwork over selfishness. He spoke often about respect for the game, for opponents, and for oneself. His words carried weight because they were lived truths, not empty slogans. Preta sat proudly beside him, barking whenever the ball came too close, as if joining in the spirit of the match. But in the crowd, the unknown man felt his resentment swell. Every cheer for Pell was a reminder of his own insignificance. He told himself that the incident with the dog had been nothing, a trifle blown out of proportion, yet here he was haunted by it. He wanted to thwart it, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw Pell's steady gaze and heard his words, "Ingso, covardia." It was as though the words had branded him, stripping him bare in front of everyone. He longed for a chance to prove himself, though he did not yet know how. That chance came unexpectedly. During one of the matches, a scuffle broke out between two older boys. Frustration boiled over, fists flew, and within moments the cheerful game threatened to dissolve into chaos. The crowd shouted, some urging the boys on, others calling for calm. Pell rose swiftly, stepping onto the field with the authority of a captain commanding his team. He separated the boys with surprising ease, his hands firm but gentle. "Ixo no futebol," he told them, his voice cutting through the noise. "Eklai, ningam vents, sozenho, jogamus juntos, ganamus juntos." The boys lowered their heads, chastened by the presence of the legend himself. It was then that the unknown man saw something he had not expected. The power of respect. Pell had not shouted, had not struck, yet the boys obeyed. The crowd hushed. Peace returned. And for a fleeting moment, the man felt a pang of something he had long buried: admiration. He remembered being a boy himself once, playing barefoot in the alleys, dreaming perhaps of glory before life had hardened him. That memory was a wound, and seeing Pell now was like salt poured upon it. He turned away, unable to watch, yet unable to leave entirely. As the tournament ended, Pell stayed to shake hands and sign autographs, never once showing fatigue. He gave each child his full attention, as if every dream mattered. When at last he prepared to leave, the unknown man made a choice. He stepped out from the shadows, his heart pounding. The crowd murmured, some recognizing him at once. A wave of disapproval rose, but Pell lifted a hand, silencing them, his gaze steady upon the man. For a long moment, they stared at each other, one burdened by shame, the other by an unspoken hope that change was possible. The man swallowed hard, his pride warring with his need. At last, he muttered, You no deviator fitu aquilo." The words were clumsy, half-formed, but they were more than he had ever admitted before. The crowd gasped softly, sensing the weight of the moment. Pell studied him, then nodded slowly. "Reconducer o primero paso," he said. His voice carried neither mockery nor triumph, only a quiet acceptance. Akura moster qui vok pod sur meltor. The man said nothing more, but something shifted within him. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of redemption, however distant. He left the field that day with the image of Pol not as an opponent, but as a mirror showing him what he could be if he chose differently. It was not an easy thought, for change never comes easily to those who have built their lives on bitterness, but it was a beginning. That night, as Pell returned home with Prater curled at his feet, he thought of the encounter. He knew the man's apology had been incomplete, perhaps even insincere in part, but it mattered. Words, once spoken, could grow into actions. He hoped that somewhere in the man's heart, kindness might take root, and if not, then at least he had shown him the path. That was all anyone could do, show the way, and trust others to walk it. Yet destiny was not finished weaving its threads. For the unknown man, the path ahead would bring trials that tested his newfound doubts. For Pell, it would demand patience, forgiveness, and the courage to lead not only on the field, but in life itself. And for Proto, the little dog who had endured a senseless kick, his role was far from over. In ways none of them could yet imagine, he would become the symbol of a story larger than himself, a story that would echo across Brazil and beyond. Weeks passed, and the incident of the doll began to fade from the daily chatter of Rio, replaced by new gossip, new scandals, and new joys. But for the unknown man, it had left a mark deeper than any scar. He could not escape the echo of Pell's words, nor the memory of the crowd's eyes burning into him with judgment. He drifted from job to job, always restless, unable to shake the feeling that his life was spiraling downward. Yet buried beneath his bitterness, there lingered a strange desire he had not known before, the desire to be seen differently, not as the cruel man who had kicked a defenseless doll, but as someone worth respect. That seed of change, planted in shame, struggled to grow, but it had not died. One evening, walking through the narrow alleys of his neighborhood, he heard shouting. A group of older boys had cornered a smaller one, pushing him, mocking him, laughing at his tears. The unknown man stopped, and for a moment his first instinct was to ignore it. Why involve himself? He was no hero. But then he remembered Pell's calm voice in the heat of that football scuffle. "Eso no fora, iso covardia." The words struck him again, sharper now, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. He stepped forward. "De exum el paz," he barked. The boys looked at him, surprised, then laughed. They knew him as the man who had kicked Pell's dog. "They phasero cost shooter ultam," one of them jeered. The words cut him, but instead of lashing out, he held his ground. "No," he said firmly. "I fisuma covardia, no val phaser outra." The boys stared at him, confused by the honesty. After a tense silence, they backed off, muttering insults but leaving the smaller boy unharmed. The boy glanced up at the man with cautious gratitude before running off. The unknown man stood there shaken. It was a small thing, but in that moment he felt something stir within him, a glimpse of who he might become if he chose differently. Meanwhile, Pell's life flowed on with its usual rhythm of appearances, interviews, and quiet evenings at home with Pretu. Yet, he too found himself thinking about the unknown man. Fame had taught him that people were not born cruel, they were shaped by wounds, by neglect, by bitterness that hardened over years. He wondered if the man had truly heard his words, if redemption was possible for someone so lost. He did not expect to ever see him again, but life has a way of weaving encounters in patterns no one can predict. That opportunity came months later. Pell had been invited to support a new program in the Fabulous, aimed at teaching children not only football but values of discipline, respect, and community. He accepted eagerly, knowing that the game had saved him as a boy and could save others still. The program needed volunteers, men and women willing to coach, mentor, and guide. And among those who showed up one morning, uncertain and awkward in his stance, was the unknown man. His clothes were worn, his eyes tired, but there was a flicker of determination in his face. He had heard of the program through whispers and thought perhaps it was a place to start again. When Pell arrived, the man felt his throat tighten. He had not expected the legend himself to be there in person. For a moment he considered fleeing, but then he remembered the boy he had defended weeks ago, and the strange sense of relief it had brought him. He forced himself to stay. Pell noticed him almost immediately. Their eyes met across the field, and though the crowd of children buzzed with excitement, the space between them grew silent. Pell walked over slowly, Pretu trotting at his side. The man lowered his gaze, ashamed. "Bok de novo," Pell said softly. There was no anger in his tone, only a wary curiosity. The man nodded. "Quero mater," he whispered. "No quero ser lembrados pelo clefis." The words trembled, but they were sincere. Pell studied him for a long moment, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "And to mostris cryinis como ser deferent, and seeing como exemplo." It was both a challenge and a gift. The work was not easy. At first, the children mocked him, remembering the stories of the doll. Some parents were weary, whispering that he could not be trusted, but Pell insisted that everyone deserved a chance to prove themselves, and slowly, with patience, the unknown man began to show a different side. He arrived early, helped set up the makeshift goals, tied shoelaces for the smallest players, and kept order when tempers flared. At night, he went home exhausted but with a strange lightness in his chest, as if each act of kindness scrubbed away a little of the stain he carried. One afternoon, during a training session, a ball rolled too close to Pretu, who had come to the field with Pell. A boy rushed forward, and in his eagerness accidentally bumped the dog, startling him. Pretu barked and the boy froze, fearing trouble. Instinctively, the unknown man stepped in. He crouched beside Pretu, stroking his fur gently, whispering reassurance until the dog calmed. Then he turned to the boy and smiled faintly. "Estudo bem, preciso ser gentle." Pale, watching from a distance, felt a warmth spread through him. The circle had closed. The man who had once hurt Pretu was now protecting him, teaching others to be gentle. It was not redemption completed, but redemption begun. The program flourished. Children who might have been lost to the streets found joy in the game, pride in teamwork, and hope in the presence of mentors. The unknown man became one of those mentors, his past slowly dissolving into the baccalaureate round, replaced by new stories of patience and guidance. People began to speak of him differently, not as the man who had kicked a dog, but as someone who had turned his life around. It was not instant, and not without setbacks, but change had rooted itself firmly. For Pell, this transformation was a quiet victory greater than any goal he had ever scored. He knew that trophies gather dust, records are broken, but kindness ripples outward endlessly. By forgiving, by offering a chance, he had helped redirect a life, and in that he found a satisfaction deeper than applause. Pretu too seemed to sense it, for he no longer shied away from the man, instead wagging his tail whenever he came near. In the silent language of animals, forgiveness had already been given. Years later, when Pell looked back on his life, he remembered not only the stadiums filled with roaring fans, not only the medals and honors, but also that small street in Rio where a cruel kick had once struck his beloved dog. He remembered the pain, the anger, but also the lesson that grew from it, that even cruelty can be transformed when met with dignity, that even the most lost soul can find a way back when given a chance. And perhaps most of all, he remembered Prato, whose simple existence had been the thread that tied it all together. Small Da, who reminded the world that kindness is the truest measure of strength. As for the unknown man, his name faded from memory, but his story lived on in whispers told around the football fields of Rio. Parents would tell their children about the man who had once been cruel but had changed, teaching them that mistakes do not define a life, but the courage to change does. And whenever those children laced their boots and stepped onto the field, they carried with them not just the dream of scoring goals like Pelé, but also the hope of living with the same dignity he had shown, even when faced with cruelty. Thus the story came full circle. What had begun as an act of pointless violence against a defenseless dog ended as a testament to forgiveness, compassion, and the power of second chances. Pelé, Prato, and even the unknown man had each played their part, and together they had woven a tale that would outlast them all, a tale that reminded the world that greatness is not only measured in goals scored, but in hearts changed.